Hi, welcome to Sundays in the Studios with the Art Gallery of Windsor. My name is Dawn Richardson, and today I'm going to show you how to make a watercolor and pencil crayon portrait. For this project, we will need some watercolor paper, some painter's tape, watercolors, either the dried palettes or the tubes, some paint brushes, and of course some pencil crayons. Now that my watercolor paper is attached firmly to the board here and it's a flat surface, the first thing I'm going to do is cover it with some water. So I'm going to take my, my brush here and just wash some water over top of it. What I'm trying to do is just to make the surface wet so that I can do a first wash of color. And when the surface is wet and the watercolors are of course wet, it will blend much easier than if we were going to be painting on a dry surface. Now that my paper is nice and wet, I'm going to take my watercolors and do that first wash, and this will serve as the background of our piece. As you can see, now I have my background, which is a nice gradient from the blue to the yellow. And I've let that dry a little bit. And so now what I'm going to do is put down the sketch layer. And I'm going to take this watercolor pen, because I'm going to use that to sketch out my drawing here. And so, of course, for the drawing, we're going to start with a circle, kind of like an egg shape for the chin. Then I usually do the nose, the mouth, and then the eyes. For this painting, I've decided to do a portrait, kind of three-quarter view-ish of a lady facing the viewer, and with like a flower. I'm thinking like a sunflower, because I really want that sunny aspect here. So with my sketch in place, now I'm going to start using my pointed brush here to actually fill in the colors. So on my palette here, I have all of my different colors. I'm going to be using this kind of brown array and this pink color here as the basis. So this first layer, I'm going to use a lot of water with this pink color, and just color in. I usually start around the neck because that's going to be one of the darkest spots on this painting, is right underneath her neck when we consider where the light's coming from, which is kind of front facing to the right of like myself or her left. So I start in those areas that are going to have more shadow, because with watercolor you're going to be adding color, and the more color that you add, the darker it's going to get. Because watercolors are semi-translucent, if you have to start light and then add in dark. With most mediums, so pencil crayons or oil paint or acrylic paint or anything like that, you can start with a dark color and then you add on the lighter color on top. With watercolors, it's the inverse, where you're starting with the lighter color and then would be adding on top of it to make something darker. So with keeping that in mind, we're going to use a very, very watered down wash first to get just the base colors down, and this would be like our very lightest color that we're going to be using, and then we're going to add on to that. A really wise art teacher once told me that with watercolors, you're building a painting. And that's actually true with any sort of painting, I suppose. With oils or acrylic, you're building a painting, but it feels specifically more true with watercolors, at least in my opinion, because you really are building up colors in certain places. So I'm going to be taking the different colors and really going in the same areas over and over again, because those are going to be the darker areas, but I'm going to keep adding to it. Now, depending on where the area is, I'm going to be using the technique of wet on wet, which means the paper is wet already, and our watercolor, of course, is wet on top. So using lots of water, and that will make the watercolor kind of bleed out and blend on its own. Another really cool thing that I love about watercolors is the textures that you can have. So by using the different techniques with the water and the paint and how that's layered, you can have a lot of cool textures. So, you know, you can see in the hair here, but also in her face, and you'll later see in the actual like flower itself. Some areas when we paint are going to end up being a little bit darker than others because there's just more paint on it. Like I was mentioning before, the watercolors you layer on top of each other, and the more layers, the darker it's going to be. So you can really add a lot of cool texture. As I continue to paint this, you'll see we're just going to keep adding darker colors. So we're still using some browns here. I'm going to use a darker brown for the shadowy areas and just build on top and keep going. Focusing in on the flower here, I'm going to start defining the petals a little bit more with a darker yellow, and then later on the same brown. It's actually the same kind of brown color, though I did mix a little bit more yellow into it, as her hair. And that's just keeping the same color palette so the painting is a lot more cohesive. In the center of the flower, you can see that I'm kind of dabbing the inside a little bit, the center of this flower. So I'm just dabbing my brush rather than dragging it along the canvas, just to make it a little bit more textured, to give that feeling of this stippling. Focusing more on her face now, I'm going to give her actual pupils so she doesn't have that ghostly blank look anymore. I'm going to use a very, very fine brush to do this part. The eyes are going to be probably the main focus. Most people look at the eyes of a painting first if it's a portrait, so I want to do a nice job of making the not look like an alien. So I'm just going to use my brown, the same brown that's her hair, and do the little circles and then fill them in a little bit, and we're also going to add some eyelashes. Great, so now I have my main portrait down. And honestly, if you're just doing watercolors, you could probably stop here or continue on with the watercolors, but I wanted to show you guys how I like to spice it up a little bit and give it a little bit more definition in my pieces with some pencil crayons. Watercolor and pencil crayons go really great together because the watercolors, once they're dry, use or serve as a really great base for pencil crayons to really bring out the colors. And I like to use pencil crayons to put in some of the little details because you can file them, or sharpen them rather, to a point, and give like the really teeny tiny little details. Now we're going to go in with the lighter colors and do some highlights, and this is the one really great part of the using pencil crayons, is that, like I was mentioning before, with watercolor, you have to start light and then add on darks on top. With pencil crayons, you can add on the lighter colors on top of the darks. So if there's areas, and there always will be areas that are a little bit darker that you want to add a little bit more contrast to, a little bit more light to, you can go in with our pencil crayon on top of the watercolor and add those in. And lastly, I'm going to use my white gel pen, and I find this is the best way to add a very bright white on top of any drawing. And I'm just going to add very, very teeny little details of white. Finally, now that our piece is dry, we've put down all of the color, we're going to take the opportunity, now that it's finished, to peel off the painter's tape, which is always super satisfying. And finally, here's our final piece. What do you think? I love using watercolors and pencil crayons together, and so I'm glad I could share that technique with you. Once again, I wanted to thank you for stopping by. My name is Sarah Richardson, and this is Sundays in the Studio with the Art Gallery of Windsor.